Buenos días a todas y a todos y bienvenidos de nuevo.
Good morning again. Welcome to this third day of the doctoral seminar of the TELS the Fifth European Award, Antonio Tajani, and the subject matter chosen by Mr. Tajani, the European Union and the principle of solidarity. After 2 intense days of work, this third day will be also as intense and as full of contents as the other ones. Well, this is a new panel with the 8th paper. TERESA, FREIXES, SANJUÁN will be chairing this panel. I'm not going to do the presentation again. She's Jean Monnet ad personam chair of and member of the jury of the Antonio Tajani doctoral grants. So Teresa, you have the floor. Thank you, Miguel, for this kind presentation and for counting me on for this this interesting session. This is such a hot topic because we've been talking about this topic for a number of years already, and we'll be talking about it for many more years. I think the 23rd June 2016, when the Brits voted, we were eager to see what was going to happen because that was something quite exceptional in Europe. And I went to bed at 2 a.m. and the Remain was 4 points ahead of the Brexit, of the no. So I was very happy, and I said to myself, well, you can have a good rest. Nothing happened. And then 3 hours later, a friend from Greece called me, and he was asking, what happened? What happened? Because the situation had completely changed, and Brexit won by a very small amount of votes, 51% against versus 48.1% who voted for Remain. And that was a very hard shock because that, of course, was a precedent. And it was a shock to me because as the way I saw it, and I take this opportunity to congratulate Elena Samarsky because it is very important to have the analysis you've done of all these problems from your point of view. And I was shocked because I was thinking about all the constitutional problems that would cause to the United Kingdom, because it wasn't a matter of staying or remaining or leaving the European Union. No, it was something else, because the UK was the cradle of Europe and democracy. It was the source of many things that we have learned in constitutional law, in parliamentarism, etc. And what I thought was that government had played very bad cards, and the case law had to settle the procedural issues. It was quite an ordeal, quite a tragedy from the constitutional point of view, I know, and that has had its consequences, especially on the Brexit negotiations with the European Union, and especially this specific topic, the freedom of movement, a critical matter, because many citizens that were nationals of other member states had to leave the UK in the face of an uncertain future. How many companies have had to relocate? Because it all disappeared. How many times in the universities I've been so worried because you have many exchange programs with the UK, research programs, we have had to renegotiate everything. We were not aware of all the consequences of the Brexit. And the Brexit was also part of a specific propaganda campaign that was an example of how to use the new technologies in a bad way, in a very bad manner. And the information that we are receiving now are quite distorted. So the work by Elena Samarsky will take us to a specific topic that she knows very well because of her own experience, and it is really important that you have worked on this. Elena has a PhD in sociology from the Oxford University. She is specialized in international relations. She is interested in topics of EU mobility through the lenses of sociology of migration and professions, industrial relations, and trade unions. And she has won several research awards and prizes for her research on intra-EU mobility, had several visiting scholar positions in Austria and Germany, and that is a testimony of the work she will be presenting today. Thank you.
Where's the... Hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome this morning. And I want to start with saying thank you for the jury who read my paper and who was kind enough to award this kind of an award, but also to the organizers for organizing such an interesting conference and the ability to present my research. And today I'm going to talk about a very specific aspect of solidarity, and this is the freedom of movement. And I will refer to one part of my PhD and talk a little bit about Brexit as well and how it impacts mobility of EU workers. So before I start with my presentation, I do want to talk a little bit about my personal experience and why I became interested in this topic. So I'm not an EU citizen, and my first experience of moving to the EU was a student mobility, and of course I had to apply for visa and so on and so forth. And when I came to Austria, I was surrounded by these kind of young, mobile professionals, academics who came to Austria from Europe, Western, Eastern, and we were talking about, and their experiences were so different, and it made me curious about what can explain this kind of difference, what's so unique about their experiences, what makes my experience unique, and that what sparkled my academic curiosity. Now, when I started to, when we think about freedom of movement, that was one of the major points in my research in trying to understand the experiences of EU citizens. And as you can see, freedom of movement is one of the pillars of the European Union, and it helps to strengthen the economy, facilitates inclusive society, and contributes to the economy and provides equal treatment. And in that sense, it was quite interesting for me to see what are the specific examples and experiences of intra-EU movers, and to maybe compare it to other forms of migrations that we know of. And in that sense, just a little bit of information. So according to most recent statistics, you have 4.2 European citizens who are currently living in another state that is not their original state. Germany and the UK remain main destination countries for intra-EU movers, and they have been one of the main destinations for years. And most recently, the countries that prevail in countries of origin are Romania, Italy, Portugal, Bulgaria, and so on. When I was first interested in the topic. I started, of course, going to the literature and examining what are available data and what's available theoretical background. And you could see quite a lot of research on on Eastern and Southern European migrants. However, much less was written about Western Europeans. Of what you can find from the available data, you could see that they do have some similarities in their migratory experiences, but also some differences. And because I was interested in this kind of a gap of how do we explain and how do we understand mobility of Western Europeans, this sparkled my interest and became the focus of my research. And from there, through my experience of talking to other European movers and my personal experience as migrant, I derived into my specific topic of the presentation, today's presentation and my dissertation, which was mobility of highly skilled professionals, and I choose a specific case study of Germans in the UK. So in that sense, I am interested in intersection of mobility, intra-EU mobility, but also labor markets of sociology of profession and how this interacts and impacts personal experiences of movers. And just a few words. So I am interested in Western European Unions, movers, and in that sense, what we know about the literature is that their mobility is relatively privileged. So they are assumed to be the ideal type of movers. They know the language, most of them have the skills, they integrate relatively easy into the labor market and to the society. So there's quite interesting discussion about what are their experiences and how it differs from others. And as I said, for my PhD, I focused on German professionals in the UK, but previously I did research on Western and Eastern Europeans who came to Austria. And again, my approach is more individual, personal, so I'm using qualitative data and interviews with these people to understand their experiences. And because my PhD was about mobility, and it was precisely during the time that the vote was, I included this in my dissertation, and of course it came up during the interviews with people, and therefore was part of the dissertation. Now, a bit about the presentation structure. So I'm going to just touch a little bit on the history of Germany, UK, and Germany, UK, and a little bit on Brexit. I am going to talk about my project because, again, we're quite an interesting group. Everyone uses different methodology, so I do want to present a little bit about how I derived my data, how I approached it, and how I analyzed it. I will talk a little bit about my empirical data, which is the main focus of my presentation, and then just a few final remarks. Now, when we are talking about the context, of course, during my project, the main focus was the European Union and freedom of movement, and at that time, when I started it, UK was part of the EU, so that was all under the umbrella of the European Union and freedom of movement. However, I think it's important to look on the larger historical data and understand what were the relationships between the UK and Germany before that. So there's a long history of migration of Germans to the UK. And however, this is the complex one. So not only that you had movers from what is now considered Germany to what is now UK since the 10th century, so they were bankers, they were working in sugar industry, they were nannies, but there were also a lot of academics. So you have this kind of a history of admiration to German academics in the UK setting, but at the same time, of course, you had the royal marriages, but also World War I and World War II, which has their own impact on mobility of Germans, and at some point during the World War I and World War II, some of them were deported, others were a restricted entry, so there's a complex relationship between the two countries in terms of mobility of Germans to the UK. When we look at the post-war history, which I found to be quite interesting when I was doing my research, and this is actually from the official data, and it's the preference of the British government for the German and Scandinavian workers already in the 50s. And this stood quite clear against the Eastern European workers, so when they were providing visa entries for work migration. And in the post-war period, because of the financial situation in Germany, there were quite a lot of usually female workers who would come to the UK to work as low-skilled in nursery, in different industries and textiles. The other component in post-war migration of Germans to the UK is the war brides. So because you had quite a large presence of British military in the UK, once they would go back with German wives or children who were born in Germany. So you have this quite large population of German-born UK nationals currently. When we think about more recent migration trend, and again, going back to statistics, you can see quite a clear division. So since 2001, you do see there are more and more German professionals who are moving to the UK. So this is a very different form of migration compared to the war brides or low-skilled migration, but also student migration. So UK has been one of the destination countries, one of the main destination countries for German nationals in terms of labor mobility and student mobility. Just a little bit about Germans in the UK. So you can see that there's a large population. There is a large population, and within German-born, a group, they are the 5th largest. Within the EU nationals, they are the 4th largest groups of EU citizens. Now, the huge difference between the numbers is explained by the historical analysis of the Bride Wars and people who, explains through the historical analysis, and you can see that those who relocated prior to 2001 usually either applied for citizenship and therefore their numbers are relatively large. When you look at more contemporary mobility since 2001, you do see that their characteristics are actually different. So those who came after 2001, not only more educated and skilled, but they also live in specific areas within the UK. So if you look at the German-born, they would be proportionally located within the whole UK, whereas if you look at those who came after 2001, you could see quite a clear, like a triangle between Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and other large university cities. So there is this kind of a differentiation between where they live, the two groups. More contemporary migration is characterized by skills, as I said, and here again, national statistics shows that German and French citizens are generally the higher skilled compared to any other EU and non-EU group that enters the UK. They are relatively young, the 34 average, and again, if you look at the numbers, you can see an increase, but then after Brexit, a little bit of a decrease in their numbers. However, if you look at the after Brexit, if you look at the applicants for settled status, despite their size in the UK, they are not top of the 5 countries. So the top 5 countries for settlement status were Poland, Romania, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, rather than Germans. And just a little bit of the context of the study and why I find it important is because when you try to understand personal experiences of these movers, you ask yourself how come, what contributed, what are the mechanisms through which mobility impacts their experiences. And here I think it's important to see the development within Western Germany and now Germany of this understanding and acceptance of mobility. And it's something that started relatively early. So West Germany was one of the first to participate in labor migration. Of course, it was for specific type of workers within specific agreements. However, it did develop to what we now know as freedom of movement. They also were the ones to participate in Schengen area. So this kind of attitude that was developed through the years. So when freedom of movement became as a citizen right, it was not something new. It was something that they were building up, and their citizens have enjoyed some types of mobility for a relatively long period. This history in the UK is a bit different for different political and geopolitical reasons. So it became part of the European Economic Community later. It did opt out of the Schengen, and as we know recently, it was their second referendum, so they joined in 73 and already in 75 they had their first referendum of whether they should stay or should leave. So again, the second one was in 16, and as Professor TERESA said, I was quite surprised as well. So it was a major event. A lot of people were unexpected for a lot of people. So it was quite interesting to see the development as well as the whole context of Brexit within my research, which was freedom of mobility, which I knew will come to the end. Now, when we talk about the project description, as I said, because quite a lot of us use different methodologies, have different questions that can be addressed through different political theoretical lenses, I do want to just describe a little bit more about specificity of my specific project. So as I said, I am interested in EU mobility, and there is quite a lot of research on EU mobility, and it does identify abolition of borders, border control as reasons for higher mobility. There's also research that indicates that EU collaboration, such as education schemes and other collaborative projects, do facilitate mobility as well as, for example, directives that encourage or try to ease and facilitate and simplify mobility, for example, of workers, such as recognition of profession. However, at the same time, when we think about mobility, it's not only about the legal framework, but also about people who actually experience it. And in their book, Smith and Favell was talking about the human face of mobility, asking people to see what kind of experiences we have, how are they related, and what we can learn from them. So as I briefly mentioned, in the available literature, there is a difference between the experiences of Western and Eastern Europeans, not only from the legal perspective in the beginning, but also in their migratory path. So if you look at the literature, there's quite a distinction of Eastern Europeans and sometimes Southern Europeans who experience more of a traditional migratory path where they have downwards mobility if we are talking about occupation, challenges with transferability of their qualifications, issues with language, bureaucracy, and social and political issues. At the same time, when we talk about Western Europeans, again, Favell suggested the framework of Eurostars, and in that sense, the idea is that for the Western Europeans, their mobility is within the context where cultural, linguistic, economic, and social barriers are removed. As such, simplified, almost frictionless. And we do see, when we think about highly skilled migration or professional movers, especially within Western European, they are considered the most privileged types of movers who can enjoy not only these aspects, but also are relatively invisible because of their integration. And you do have quite research, especially more recently, that is focused specifically on Western Europeans, and this is just a few examples. Scott looked at British who are living in France, in Paris. Favell looked in general on Western Europeans who lived in Brussels, London, and Amsterdam, so you have this type of research. Kukalainen, she looked at Finnish nationals who live in the EU, and Ryan and Mulholt, they did a huge research on French in the UK. So you do have these kind of pockets of research trying to understand the specificity of this group. However, and although in general the assumption is that it's free because the barriers are removed, they still found that those migrants, ideal type of migrants, the privileged, are not really immune to all the other challenges. So once they relocate, they do still face barriers associated with different issues, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And of course, with Brexit, you do have a new line of research that focuses specifically not only on the consequences on the legal framework, but also how Brexit is experienced by people. Finally, a little bit about my methodology. So as I said, I did qualitative research using in-depth interviews, and I conducted 52 interviews with German professionals working in the UK, and I specifically chose the group partially because, as I said, I'm interested in mobility, on mobility, migration, and transferability of educational professionalism, so that's why I was interested in a specific category of professionals. I also interviewed 13 of their partners. So in my sample, I have 13 couples. I did make separate interviews, so separately each partner. They were all employed according to their qualifications and obtained their diploma outside of the UK. And in that sense, I do differentiate between mobility, study mobility and mobility of professionals. So that's why they were excluded. They were relatively young, so from 24 to 54, working age, and 2/3 moved with family. And that was one of the reasons why in the beginning, straight away, I did decide to include their partners, because if you move as a family, there might be additional aspects that one needs to consider rather than if you move as a single person. They were in various stages of their life and careers, so as I said, some were married, some had children, and had different occupations, from postdocs to managers to senior bankers. So there's quite a variation in their occupation and their career stage. And finally, they worked again across different industries: academia, automobile, gambling, and finance. So in that sense, it is quite a large pool with different industrial angles. And they spent 5 years in the UK on average. Partially it does come from my interest in the more modern migration, but also using interviews, I wanted to see to what extent they can recollect their decisions, and it is better to use more recent data. And I did my interviews around Oxford, London, and Cambridge, and as I said previously, not only that you do find quite a large disproportional amount of highly skilled Germans in that area, but also it's not only because of the universities. Like, for example, Oxford, the area near Oxford, you do have a BMW plant there, which transfers quite a lot of Germans from Germany to work in those plants. You have a European Space Agency, which of course has also German nationals. Sometimes they apply there, sometimes they go through transfers. So the area is full of different industries, not only academia, but also finance and automobile. Now, when I started my research, and when you approach these kind of topics, you just ask very general questions and see where it goes. So it's not that in my mind, or I did them ask, how did the EU contribute to your mobility? It's something that came up during the interviews, something that was spontaneously mentioned. And most of my interviews, I think all of them, have mentioned it as the first thing. And for them, EU mobility was really linked to some kind of a natural move. And it was, of course, based on the legal and bureaucratic perspective, but the description, the wording was something that I found to be quite interesting. So this is one of the quotes, and Fabian says, "Because UK is an EU country, it's so easy to move here. It felt so natural. It also helps not feeling as an expert or a migrant. I don't need a work permit or anything. The only thing you need is national security number, but it also so unbureaucratic. No hurdle. For people from Asia, it is different. They have to apply for visa. They pay extra tax for NHS." So this kind of connection of intra-EU mobility, freedom of movement as a natural right, and this differentiation between intra-EU migrants and non-EU migrants was quite interesting to see. A lot of them did not consider themselves as migrants, and that would go partially because of the legal aspects. So to be a migrant, they considered you need to be from outside, you need to apply for visa, and so the experience is very different. On the other side, I have another quote for you here, and this is Matthias, and he said, "Between EU countries, it's so easy to move. I mean, when I moved here, it was just move for an idea. Let's see what happens. And it wasn't fixed whether I would stay in the UK or not." And this is quite interesting again, and stands in contrast to what we know about traditional paths of migration, which is temporary mobility. They do not know whether they're going to stay or not. They do not know whether they will apply for citizenship and why would they do that. So there's this kind of temporariness. I just move there because I have the ability. Why not? Let's see how it moves. And if I don't like it, I can always go back or I can go to another country. And in that sense, I think to understand these experiences, it's quite important to go back to the history and see how those Germans grew up. And growing up within this area, knowing that mobility is part of your routine, part of normalization of your life, contributed to this perception that mobility is your right, is free, it's there, it's something to use. And in that sense, freedom of movement was prescribed as a natural right and contributed to the mobility being described as something easy, as cost-free, and this experience was a normality rather than an exceptional changing life event. The other aspect that I found to be quite interesting in my research was how EU was considered as a single labor market. Of course, it is a bit more complicated, I'm going to talk about it, but in that sense, talking about searching for a job in the EU as a whole, rather than thinking about specific countries and applying there. And here is an example of Max, and he said, I saw this job and I applied because it matched my profile so well. I like all the things asked for in the job advert. I basically ticked all the boxes. So it was rather approach through labor mobility, something interesting to do, rather than, again, change in standards of life or any other reasons that we actually know from other types of migrants that is described in the literature. On the other side, while it was first presented as a single labor market, where the opportunities are just around, people were aware of the differences between different national states, and this is an example of Mona, excuse me, and she said, of course I like Spain, I like Italy, but then I exclude those countries from her job search. They don't have a good economic situation, and they don't want any German researchers in the moment. I am aware of that. So there is this kind of complexity from one side. You are open to look everywhere. On the other side, you are aware of the differences between different member states. Another aspect that I found to be quite prevalent in my research was the impact of international cooperation and EU cooperation and different mobility schemes. And I want to start with the quote from Bernard, and he said, I met people from this company at a conference, and then we talked about the possibility of coming for 1 month's visit. I liked it. Actually, they contacted me about a postdoc, but at the time I wasn't finished with my PhD. I said I can't apply, but I will be happy to come for a month. After finishing my PhD, I applied for a postdoc position at the company. This was in February, and in October I started. And this was, again, a very illustrative case, but something that came up and again in my research, because almost 2/3 of the sample had at least some experience of previous mobility, and that was either for conferences but also for short visits. A lot worked in different collaborative schemes, so for example for their PhDs or for their studies like Erasmus. Others had experienced mobilities through their work. So for example, moving through the offices, like Deutsche Bank, for example, having moved from Frankfurt to London for a week or two for work purposes. So you do have these collaborations, which of course helped to create mobility paths, and that was quite interesting to find, and the extent of it. Now, when we think about this kind of mobility, and it's not only cooperation, as I said, in the academic sphere, but also in the industrial collaboration and the branches of German companies, such as the plant of the BMW, as I mentioned, but also the Deutsche Bank. I think these are the two quite famous examples. In that sense, mobility was perceived as just, as I said before, as just normalization of professional life. When I wanted to understand more what does that mean, and through the analysis you could see that these kind of cooperative agreements did impact mobility in two aspects. The first one was through creation of networks. So once the networks were created, you could get information about potential job offers abroad, but you could also have more detailed information which could provide you with some benefits of applying for a specific job. The other one was due to this previous migratory experiences, which was perceived as a positive, there was a desire to move again. So based on these kind of two aspects, mobility was again facilitated through personal experience, but also through networking. And finally, when I was analyzing why they chose the EU and why freedom of movement was important, I came around another aspect, and which was EU and the concept of solidarity, which is the main idea of today's talk. And this is the example of Ula, and she says, "It's also because I felt more connected to Europe and to other European countries. I recognized it when I lived in the States. If I would put it in one word, then I would probably say it's solidarity. It feels here in Europe we have a greater understanding of what solidarity means. We do care about people around us, even when it's against our own interest. I feel this somehow important. I prefer to stay in Europe." And this kind of difference in the attitudes between the US and Europe would come in my research quite often, and I will actually focus on it a little bit later, because quite a lot of my participants either lived in the US or studied in the US or contemplated to move there for work. So it was always on their radar. And this type of solidarity, so cultural proximity, European values, social and cultural proximity played a role simplifying but also defining the migratory route and making the clear preference to stay within the European Union. And of course, so this kind of concludes my first section, which I hope to provide some kind of understanding of how freedom of movement was interpreted and experienced by my participants. Now, of course, because my research took part within the specific context of Germans in the UK, I think it's quite interesting to think and to identify what were the unique characteristics of the UK that were more attractive, or how come that within the variety of European unions, my participants ended up in Britain. And this would be the next section of my presentation. So going back to the national context and why Britain, and using my data and the analysis, I could identify several aspects that contributed to this specific migratory path. And one of them is language. So because we are talking about labor mobility and people who would prefer to either move to similar positions or to higher positions, being able to articulate their ideas to actually create the work resulted on their language competence. And that's why for quite a lot of them, Britain was almost the only country they wanted to go. On the other side, when we think about language, it's not only to perform employment-related aspects. When language was described, or when language came up in the interviews, it was also associated with political activity. So for example, if you move to another country and you don't know the language, it might be a barrier for social and political activity in the area, which was again quite important for my participants. They didn't only want to move somewhere and work there, they wanted to be part of the society and take active actions. So that was the first aspect of language. The other aspect was related to the British industry. And this was not only the prestige, for example, like in the case of academia, but also size. And this was quite prevalent in the case of finance, but also publishing. So for example, people who worked in the publishing field in Germany would tell me that the English-speaking market is much larger, so when they move from Germany to the UK, they will have a larger set of responsibilities, which they found to be quite interesting. So for them, that it was a scale that attracted them in the UK. And as I said before, as I previously mentioned, the US-UK distinction was something that came up also when we were talking about language and about industry. Because if you look at publishing, if you look at higher education, and if you look at finance, another option, viable option for these professionals would be the US, with New York. And when they were contemplating whether they would apply to the US or make intra-company transfer to US, then the aspect of solidarity, so the aspect of shared European values came up, a legal aspect, and this we go back to the beginning of my presentation, of not needing to apply for a visa at the time before Brexit, which played a role, and then of course geographic proximity, which was quite interesting as well. This notion that EU is relatively close, and if you do want to go and see your friends and family during the weekend, you can just either take a flight or take a train or drive a car, and you're going to be there, which is quite different in the case if you actually move to the US. So these kind of three aspects were mostly mentioned when the discussion about labor market began. The last aspect that contributed to that was the recruitment practices. And in that sense, when they were talking about their experience in transitioning between the two labor markets, the German and the British, they would say, the British are so effective. I had an interview, and then 2 weeks afterwards, I got an offer. And this was something that was mentioned in both academia and in industry. And when we were talking about, they would put it in contrast to the German recruitment strategy, which, again, according to my participants, which was much more prolonged, required a longer period of time to wait whether they will get any response or not. And especially when I was talking to academics, they would mention the road to professorship. So you need to have these links to the professor to be able to have career development, whereas the UK was perceived as a merit-based. You can just apply wherever you want and you will get the job based on your skill set rather than on some kind of political or intrapersonal relationships. Another aspect that I want to mention in relation to the national context of Germany and the UK is the actual experiences of German nationals. And because the history between the two countries was quite complex, as I said, from one side admiration to science, from the other the World War periods, my question was, I was interested and curious in what were their experiences. And then this is the example of Klaus, and he says, I think a lot of discrimination you get is a positive, because when people have the prejudice that you are hardworking, honest, and punctual, it's kind of boring, but it's actually quite good. It's better than the stereotypes of being lazy and criminal that has happened tons and tons. And I think, again, going back to the historical analysis shows why that might happen. And I'm not the only one who have seen this kind of favorism, that privileged position of Germans within the existing system of prejudice in the UK. Vlasna, in her research, she also found very similar results in regard to this aspect. And as I said before, partially it can be explained by the fact that within the national statistic and then the reports, they do say that Germans are relatively highly skilled. There was this historical preference for them as workers, but also there's almost no, especially before Brexit, discussion in the media about German migrants. And this is the quote from one of the articles in the Telegraph, and they say, German-born population prefers life under the radar. They keep in a low profile. They do not dominate the high street with schnitzel restaurants or corner sausage shops. And finally, as I mentioned in the literature, while this kind of a discussion of mobility seemed to provide a very specific narrative of frictionless migration, cost-free, it was not as easy and it still had some barriers. So EU mobility was, again, through my research, was not as frictionless as maybe anticipated. And in that sense, it does resemble some of the characteristics of other types of migrants. And I'm going to just mention a few. And again, because my sample had a relatively easy transition in the labor market perspective, what came up was the challenges that were associated with social and family context. In that sense, movers did not move by themselves, they had their families, so they had to move together with their partners, with their children. They had to think about what their partners will do after migration. Will they be able to find a job? How they will put their children in the local kindergarten? Do they want to put them in the local school? Do they want to put them in the German school? So all of these things have contributed to the stress and presented challenges for movers post-migration. The same was about extended family. So they did move to the UK. However, their families, parents who were older, stayed in Germany. So the question arises, who's going to provide transnational care? And finally, of course, the issue of unexpected challenges. And Brexit, I think, provides quite a good example for that. And I'm going to just provide a few quotes, because I think my research has provided quite a good background to understand in which case and how the end of the freedom of movement impacted those my participants. And in that sense, as I said previously, Brexit, there's a difference, the legal and practical consideration. And here's the quote from Ulla, and she said, "I looked for jobs in the EU. Of course, I'm realistic. I consider practical issues. Norway is probably not on my list because they're not European Union, and Swiss visa is complicated." So this kind of understanding that visa regimes are barrier to mobility was there for a while. So the question is, how will that affect future mobility to the UK? The other aspect was, again, something that came up, and it was related to pensions. How are we going to secure that we can access the pension funds after we leave the UK? And that had impacted people in different ways. So some, for example, decided to shorten their stay and do not get longer years of participation in the British market, where they did not know whether they're going to use the pension, while others prefer to stay longer because they have already invested in the pension funds in the UK. Then, when we talk about freedom of movement, and we're talking about Brexit, what came up was also the aspect of continuation of freedom of movement. And in that sense, those who could apply for British citizenship or settlement status would have said to me that they would do that just because they do want to have this freedom of moving between the countries, and especially going back to Germany, because as I said, quite a lot of them had families there, so they didn't want to be to have this kind of a barrier between the countries. And here the question is, will everyone meet the criteria? Will they be able to finance it? So there are practical aspects that one needs to consider when thinking about the legality of their status in the UK. And finally, what I find to be quite interesting was the emotional response to Brexit. So when Brexit, the vote happened, I want to introduce Thomas here, and he said, "It was really meant to be until retirement. The perception may be changed after Brexit. That can be frustrating for foreigners, of course, and make insecurities." And in the interviews, it was, again, described in a very emotional, as an emotional aspect, and linked to betrayal of European principles. So growing up within this understanding of Europe as a whole, of freedom of movement as a granted right, and then this clash between how they grew up, how they perceived to be their natural right, and something that was happening in the UK, which was clashing with their own perspectives. So the question is, what are the futures? And what I want to do with this slide is show that it's actually quite complex. On the national level, of course, there are going to be different regulations, and depending on the labor market situation, we will see what's going to be, we will see what kind of future migration flows will emerge from the UK, from the EU to the UK. But on the individual level, when we talk about Brexit, we need to think about how they will respond. And then the question is, it depends on the time. So if they have just recently moved, there's less incentives to stay, where if they have lived in the UK for 10 years and they, almost done, and they're gonna have been involved there, so they might want to stay. Employment, if they have a job, they might want to stay, but also family context. Once you moved with family and spouses, maybe there's no legal or moral aspect of moving the family again to some kind of insecurity. And finally, when we talk about Brexit, the question is, the border returns, how is it going to impact not only those who are already in the country, but also future mobility of those who maybe were considering coming to the UK, but might change their opinion, or as well as going to impact the financial and legal aspects, but also emotional. So this kind of an emotional response, seeing it as a betrayal of the European principles.
Muchas gracias, Elena, por esta intervención que nos ha explicado magníficamente el contexto de su trabajo. Yo voy a pasar la palabra a quien quiera hacer comentarios. Únicamente insistirle un poquito que cuando trata el marco legal referido a los tratados de la libre circulación, haga también una pequeña referencia al contexto constitucional en el propio Reino Unido, porque existen allí también resoluciones judiciales que son muy importantes al respecto. ¿Quién quiere intervenir, por favor? Susana.
Felicidades, Elena, por tu despliegue de información y por aterrizar en un tema que realmente desde el 2016, bueno, incluso antes, porque todos sabemos que la Unión Europea, desde el análisis de la política de integración, realmente nunca ha estado completamente integrada en el proceso político europeo. Yo creo que eso es algo que hay que siempre, a lo que hay que dar siempre mucha atención, porque claro, de ello deriva lo que ha sucedido en el referéndum de junio del 2016 y en el que, como explicaba muy bien en tu presentación la profesora TERESA FREIXES, seguimos en ello, porque esto va a seguir. Las fronteras se están moviendo, porque todo lo que implica el Brexit hace que las fronteras comerciales, financieras, políticas de impacto a todos los niveles, educativo, me gusta muchísimo cómo lo enlazas con la educación, pues tiene desde luego una influencia enorme, ¿no? Incluso estoy pensando en el trabajo de Nuria Ferré, pensando en las fronteras, todo este puzzle geopolítico. Y bueno, quiero llamar la atención sobre un tema que creo que sería importante que tuvieses en cuenta en la redacción de tu trabajo final. Hay un tiempo en el que, cuando la campaña del referéndum está atendiendo más a las falsas noticias, yo no creo en la palabra posverdad. A mí no me gusta la palabra posverdad. Yo creo que lo que es verdad, lo que es mentira. Y bueno, cuando están las noticias falsas ahí interviniendo en el referéndum, también pasó en los referéndums en Francia y en Países Bajos, cuando el proyecto de Constitución Europea. Claro, hay una información que lo que hace es que esa pequeña diferencia entre los porcentajes en la votación se incline y nos vayamos, el Reino Unido se vaya de la Unión Europea, con lo que implica. Y ahí los jóvenes, y lo digo porque está muy enlazado al tema de educación, al que tanta atención y también dedicas en tu trabajo, ahí los jóvenes realmente piensan: no hace falta ir a votar, no es importante ir a votar. Y entonces, claro, si ves el abanico del porcentaje de edades que votan a favor de irse de la Unión Europea o a favor de quedarse, si algunos jóvenes hubiesen visto que su futuro depende directamente, su futuro europeo, como ciudadanos europeos, con todo lo que conlleva en relación a educación, en relación a sus vidas, a viajar, a la libre circulación, a Schengen, bueno, pues quizás no, seguro que habrían ido a votar. Y esa pequeña diferencia de ese 49-51% podría haber sido perfectamente a favor de quedarse, de permanecer en la Unión Europea. Entonces, bueno, creo que eso es algo a lo que debes atender, puesto que tratas mucho el tema de la educación, muy bien llevado, muy bien analizado. Y luego también decir, en relación al tema constitucional, del que apuntaba la profesora FREIXES ahora a tu trabajo, yo cuando veo, después de todo el proceso con Theresa May, cuando llega Boris Johnson y cierra el Parlamento, es que cierra el Parlamento, o sea, cierra la voz de los ciudadanos británicos, ciudadanos europeos todavía, y decide cerrar la voz del Parlamento, cuando han sido los ciudadanos los que han optado por irse, que era o sea, es una contradicción enorme y desde la perspectiva y del análisis constitucional yo creo que es un hecho en el que hay que llamar la atención porque hay que hacer las cosas bien y porque lo constitucional y la democracia representativa no se puede cerrar un Parlamento. Muchas gracias.
Sí, vamos a coger 2 o 3 palabras más para que responda de conjunto, porque vamos un poco apretados de tiempo. ¿Quién quiere intervenir, por favor?
Sí, a mí me gustaría decir algo siempre, concreto. Me ha gustado mucho la presentación que has hecho, me ha gustado mucho sobre todo ese enlace que has realizado entre el efecto movilidad y el efecto solidaridad, que yo estaba intentando buscarlo, no dónde encontrarlo, pero el hecho de que en la Unión Europea la libertad de movimiento sea algo normal y la importancia de que se entienda la movilidad como algo normal, ¿no? Dentro de nuestro contexto, algo que, como decías, que entenderías como que debería ser un derecho que no debería ser excepcional y cómo esa movilidad facilita el entendimiento, la comprensión, el contacto entre la gente y al final eso pues radica en una mayor solidaridad. Creo que ahí es donde has encontrado el enlace. Con el efecto Brexit se produce un efecto colateral dentro del propio Reino Unido. Yo entiendo que has tocado sobre todo lo que es la parte de los ciudadanos del exterior del Reino Unido hacia el Reino Unido. Te has centrado mucho en el caso alemán, pero quisiera saber, y sé que no es fácil porque tu trabajo es sobre todo de campo, pero a lo mejor lo puedes averiguar a través de los medios de comunicación, ese efecto que ha tenido en el escape, la huida de los propios británicos, de los propios ingleses hacia el exterior. Yo tengo varios amigos que han huido, o sea, se han ido a Irlanda, se han ido a Bruselas, intentando cambiar de nacionalidad para seguir teniendo esa ventaja que les ofrece Europa de movilidad y, por tanto, de oportunidades. Entiendo que no es fácil a estas alturas y tampoco los efectos están muy bien estudiados, pero sé que en prensa se ha estado tocando y, bueno, no sé si las has seguido de cerca, pero creo que es un concepto también interesante saber cómo el Brexit ha afectado al propio sentimiento de ciudadanía de los propios ingleses que han escapado de su país por la falta de oportunidades que les planteaba la salida del Reino Unido. Gracias.
Sí, por favor.
Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Mi pregunta versa sobre un tema que me ha parecido muy curioso por la novedad que aporta, ¿no? Habitualmente pensamos que cuando una persona migra a otro país, tiende, pese a haber migrado, habitualmente a vivir en pequeñas comunidades en las cuales está rodeado de sus mismos nacionales, ¿no? Y entonces, tú comentabas en tu presentación que, derivado de tus entrevistas, uno de los argumentos que aportaban los alemanes para emigrar al Reino Unido era precisamente el no tener esa barrera idiomática que en otros casos de migrantes les puede aislar en un primer momento y eso puede que sea definitivo, al menos en su generación, quizá no en la de sus descendientes, y allí se quedan, pero ellos se querían integrar socialmente, entonces decían, pues voy a ir al Reino Unido porque allí no voy a tener esa barrera idiomática, ¿no? Entonces, y si se querían integrar socialmente, no sé si en tus entrevistas abordaste el tema de cuál fue su implicación en su entorno cuando llegó el referéndum para el Brexit. Ellos se implicaron en ese momento activamente en la sociedad diciendo nosotros somos un claro ejemplo de por qué es bueno seguir siendo parte de la Unión Europea o no, o si más siguieron haciendo sus distintos trabajos, siguieron con sus vidas, igual que ponías ahí la referencia a la publicación de Guardian en la que los británicos alababan a los alemanes por no estar muy activos, digamos, con sus tradiciones, digamos, alemanas en el Reino Unido. Si hubo, digamos, algo de eso, de apoyo, por así decirlo, a la causa del Remain o si fueron pasivos.
Una última intervención. Pues entonces, Elena, por favor, si quieres, puede responder.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments, and I'll start from the last one. And I think it was like 2 questions. So the first about the environment in which Brexit happened. From my reading the area, the UK, and what happened there, I didn't see them taking the streets to demonstrate against Brexit. So it was not maybe some of them did that, but it was not like a huge political action of let's stop it. I don't know how to explain it. I think, again, some of them just decided to move on because it does take an investment. So those who wanted to stay, who have spent longer years in the UK, have applied for citizenship and settlement status, but others, I think, again, in the statistics, you do see that they flee, they go away. So I think that was of an approach. Of course, you had demonstrations, but I don't really know to what extent Germans were part of it as a group. And the other question you asked, or the comment about language, I find it quite interesting because some of them did, for example, speak Dutch or French, so they know at least one other language, but the competence, the ability to work in the language was one of the determining fact. So the fact that they could just relocate and use the language for the work, as well as to create friends. And in that sense, if you look at the UK Germans, from my data, they did not search for other Germans to have like German friends around. They were quite international in that sense. So there's not a huge community sense of I'm moving to the UK, but I will live with Germans and my friends will be Germans, quite international. And they also live in the cities that are very international. So London, Oxford, Cambridge, you have people from everywhere. And then this kind of a language provides you with a social environment. So that's the language issue. The other aspects, I think it's quite important to include the institutional context. Thank you for saying that. And in the final draft, I will. I think, again, I would try to put more emphasis, which is not currently in the draft, on what actually happened during Brexit and before Brexit, from the legal point of view, but also from the media. And I think there was, again, the topic of migration was one of the main topics when they were talking about the vote. As they maybe did not think about migration of Germans, but it is a whole package. So. Maybe that will be, again, something that can be added to my paper. And I think it will add an additional angle to see it not only from the constitutional side, but also from the media and how it was covered, because it was covered quite extensively. And again, migration was the topic and the word used in every second article. So I think that's all.
Muchas gracias, Elena, por todo esto. Realmente es un tema crucial en la historia de la Unión Europea, lo que has abordado.
Sorry, thank you, Elena. This is really a critical topic in the history of the European Union. I find it extremely inspiring because you have explained many things that we couldn't have known just with the analysis of a normative analysis. We couldn't have perceived them with just a normative analysis. So I liked that synergy between both points of view, which is an added value, as we have said, of many of your presentations. So thank you.